She was 25, and for all intents and purposes, homeless. After the rail yard closed her late husband's account, there was no family, no money, and no plan. Just a small, hand-forged steel bird in her pocket, and the $3 that constituted her final pay. And with that $3, she bought an abandoned, welded-shut boxcar, sitting on a forgotten spur of track outside Laramie, Wyoming. But what nobody in that dusty rail town knew, what no one could have guessed, was that sealed inside that rusted iron shell was a secret 40 years old, a secret that would change her life forever. So settle in and stay close. Let us know where you're watching from tonight as we tell the story of Clara Harrow and the $3 boxcar. Clara had not been born to the railroad, but she had been made by it. She arrived in Wyoming at 19, a girl from a hard-luck Ohio farm where the soil gave out before the people did. She was promised a position as a laundress for a hotel, but the position had been filled months before her coach even crossed the Platte River. It was Liam Harrow who found her, sitting on her trunk at the depot, not crying but staring at the far-off mountains with a look of grim appraisal, as if measuring them for a fitting. He was a yard machinist for the Union Pacific, a man with grease ground into the lines of his hands and a quiet kindness in his eyes. He saw not a lost girl, but a fellow survivor. He bought her a meal, and then another, and within 6 months they were married, living in a small 2-room house in the company town that huddled in the shadow of the great repair shops. Liam was her mentor in the ways of this new world. He taught her the language of the yard, the difference between a highball and a deadhead, the meaning of the whistle codes that echoed through the valley day and night. He brought home scrap metal, shards of boilerplate, sheared bolts, flawed castings, and explained the nature of their failures, the subtle signs of stress and fatigue in iron and steel. He taught her to read the railroad's own dense literature, timetables, freight manifests, and the company ledgers where men's lives were entered as debits and credits. She had a quick mind for it, a head for numbers and patterns that surprised him. While other wives complained of the soot and the noise, Clara learned to find the rhythm in it, the great, pulsing, mechanical heartbeat of the nation. For a wedding gift, Liam had forged her a small bird from a piece of high-quality Damascus steel, its wings upswept, its body layered with the subtle, watery patterns of the folded metal. It was impossibly delicate for such a strong material, a perfect thing born of fire and skill. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever owned, and she carried it in her apron pocket always, a cool, solid weight against her thigh. Their life was not easy, but it was theirs. It was a life measured in paydays and steam pressure, in the scent of hot oil and the shrill call of the shop whistle. It was a life built on the unyielding certainty of iron, a certainty that shattered the day Liam was caught between 2 shunting cars, his life extinguished as quick and final as a snuffed lantern. The end of her life with the railroad came not with a bang, but with a piece of paper. A week after she buried Liam in the small, windswept cemetery overlooking the yard, a man from the company office knocked on her door. His name was Mr. Davies, and he wore a suit that was too clean for the grit-laced air of the town. He did not remove his hat. He handed her a thin envelope containing Liam's final pay, $33, and a second folded document. It was a notice of eviction. Her right to company housing, he explained without a trace of sympathy, had terminated upon the closing of Foreman Harrow's account. The house was needed for a new family, a living workers' family. He spoke as if reading from a manual, his voice devoid of inflection. Clara stood in the doorway, her hands clasped before her, and simply nodded. She did not plead or argue. She had watched the company for 6 years. She knew it was as deaf and unyielding as a granite cliff. Arguing with Mr. Davies would be like shouting at a locomotive. He was not a man. He was a function, a gear in the vast machine that had consumed her husband and was now casting her out. After he left, she stood in the center of the small room, the eviction notice cool in her hand. The air was thick with the scent of Liam, of oil and metal, and the faint, sweet smell of the pipe tobacco he smoked in the evenings. She looked at the sturdy furniture he had built, the shelf of books he had been so proud of, the worn spot on the floor where he sat to pull off his boots. These things were no longer hers. They belonged to the house, and the house belonged to the company. She spent $30 of her $33 to have Liam's tools, his most prized possessions, crated and shipped to his brother in California. It was what he would have wanted. Then, she began to pack. It did not take long. She had a small trunk for her clothes, a sewing box with her needles and threads, and the heavy cast-iron Singer sewing machine her own mother had given her. She wrapped it carefully in blankets, her most valuable and practical asset. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows from the smokestacks, she swept the floor one last time, closed the door behind her without looking back, and walked away from the only home she had known as a married woman, her worldly possessions loaded onto a borrowed handcart. She did not cry. The time for tears was a private thing, and her grief was her own, not a spectacle for the company's pity. She had $3 left, and the small steel bird in her pocket. Her journey was not one of miles, but of feet, a slow, grinding passage from the heart of the company town to its frayed edges. She pushed the handcart herself, the iron wheels groaning over the cinder-strewn ground. Every turn of the wheels was an act of will. The cart was heavy with the weight of her sewing machine, a dense anchor of self-reliance. She passed the neat rows of identical houses, each with its small patch of yard, and felt the shift in the air. Windows that had once held friendly faces now held curtains that twitched and fell still. The women she had shared coffee with, whose children she had patched clothes for, now looked away, their faces tight with a mixture of pity and fear. Clara's fate was a chilling reminder of their own precarity. They were all just one accident, one illness, one pink slip away from the same walk. The men, coming off their shifts, grimy and exhausted, tipped their hats with a new kind of solemnity, their eyes holding a respectful distance. She was no longer one of them. She was a widow, a loose piece of driftwood in the powerful current of the railroad. The familiar sounds of the yard, the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the hiss of steam, the deafening roar of a locomotive passing on the main line, seemed different now, alien and menacing. The place that had been the backdrop of her life, the source of her security, was now just a landscape of noise and industry that had no place for her. She pushed on, past the machine shops and the roundhouse, its dark maw swallowing and disgorging engines. She followed the tracks out to the sprawling salvage yard, a graveyard of iron where the railroad's broken things were left to rust. Piles of bent rails lay like fallen giants. Mountains of shattered ties bled creosote into the soil. Here, on the literal and social margins of the town, an auction was scheduled for the following morning, a place where the unwanted was sold for pennies on the dollar. She found a sheltered spot behind a wall of discarded boilerplates, the metal still radiating a faint warmth from the day's sun. She unrolled her blanket, ate a piece of dry bread she had saved, and sat with her back against the cold iron. The sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in violent strokes of orange and purple. The temperature began to drop. From her vantage point, she could see the entire town lit up below, a constellation of warm, yellow lights. Each light was a home, a family, a life she was no longer a part of. She pulled her shawl tighter, her hand closing around the steel bird in her pocket. It was cold, but its familiar weight was a comfort, a tangible link to a time when she had belonged. She was an outsider now, adrift in a sea of iron and indifference. Her past was a closed account. Her future was a terrifying blank. All she had was the present moment, the grit under her thin blanket, and the $3 that stood between her and absolute destitution. The morning of the auction dawned cold and clear, the sky a pale, washed-out blue. The salvage yard was already stirring with activity. Men with calculating eyes and calloused hands moved through the lots, kicking at piles of scrap, assessing the value of decay. They were scrap dealers, handymen, and ranchers, men who knew how to turn one man's trash into their own treasure. Clara stood apart, a small, still figure in a dark dress, easily overlooked. She watched and listened, her face impassive. The auctioneer, a stout man with a booming voice and a stained waistcoat, climbed onto a flatbed car and began his rapid-fire patter. He sold off lots of rail spikes, kegs of rusted bolts, and stacks of lumber salvaged from a collapsed trestle. The bidding was brisk but low. These were men who knew the value of $1. Clara stayed her hand, waiting. Her $3 felt impossibly small, a child's allowance in a world of men's commerce. Then, the auctioneer pointed to the end of the line, at a single boxcar sitting alone on a disconnected spur of track, weeds growing up around its silent wheels. "All right, gentlemen," he boomed, "Lot 47. One standard 40-foot boxcar, sold as is, where is?" A murmur went through the small crowd. The car was a strange beast. Its sides were thick with rust, the original painted lettering of a long-defunct railway, barely visible beneath the corrosion. But its most peculiar feature was the door. It had been welded shut, not with a few tacks of metal, but with thick, ugly seams of iron running the entire height of the doors on both sides. A few men walked over, rapping their knuckles against the steel. It rang with a dull, solid thud. "What's the story on it, Charlie?" one of the dealers called out. The auctioneer shrugged. "Came in on a transfer 40 years ago. Paperwork got lost, bill of lading was missing. The company sealed it to secure the contents against a claim, and then the claim never came. Been sitting here ever since. We can't open it, and we can't move it without a crane. We're selling the car, and whatever might, or might not, be inside. Scrap value only." A laugh went through the crowd. It was a pig in a poke, a fool's gamble. It could be loaded with valuable goods, or it could be filled with rocks, or most likely, it was completely empty. A hollow iron shell that would cost more to cut apart than the scrap was worth. "Let's start the bidding at $5 for the scrap," the auctioneer said. Silence. $4? Still silence. The men were looking at it now with disdain. It was a problem, not an opportunity. "All right, who'll give me $3 for the trouble of looking at it?" the auctioneer said, his voice edged with impatience. Before the laughter could start, a quiet voice cut through the air. $3. Every head turned. Clara stood with her chin up, her gaze fixed on the auctioneer. The men stared, first in disbelief, then with amusement. The widow Harrow, buying a welded-shut boxcar? The auctioneer blinked, surprised, sold. He barked, slamming his gavel onto a crate. "To the lady in black, for $3. He took her money, scribbled a receipt on a piece of paper, and the auction moved on. The men gave her a wide berth, some shaking their heads in pity, others smirking at her foolishness. But Clara didn't see them. She was looking at the boxcar. It was hers, a useless, rusted, sealed iron box that nobody wanted, an object as lost and isolated as she was. She owned a boxcar she could not enter. For 2 days, she lived in its shadow, a squatter on her own property. She used her sewing skills to mend clothes for a few of the section hands' wives in exchange for food, a loaf of bread, a handful of potatoes, a jar of milk. The women were kind, but their pity was a heavy blanket she did not want. At night, she slept under the massive, silent bulk of the car, listening to the wind sigh through the rusted undercarriage. She spent hours studying it, walking its length, running her hands over the coarse, flaking rust and the brutal, thick welds. There were no visible markings to indicate its contents, only the ghost of a name: Allegheny and Western Freight. Her husband Liam had spoken of the smaller lines that the Union Pacific had swallowed up decades ago, their rolling stock absorbed or abandoned. This car was a relic from that earlier time. It was clear she could not open it alone. The welds were too thick, the steel too solid. She needed fire and a strong arm. There was only one man in town with the skill and the tools for such a job. George Pike, the railroad blacksmith. He was a widower himself, a large, quiet man who had kept to his forge since his wife's passing 5 years prior. He was known for his skill, his honesty, and his preference for the company of iron over people. Gathering her courage, Clara walked from the salvage yard to the smithy, a journey that took her back into the heart of the town. The smithy was a dark, cavernous building, smelling of coal smoke, hot metal, and horse. George Pike was at the anvil, his face illuminated by the glowing heart of the forge, his hammer blows ringing with a powerful, steady rhythm. He was shaping a new drawbar, his movements economical and precise. He didn't stop when she entered, finishing the heat before placing the glowing metal aside and turning to her, wiping his hands on a leather apron. His eyes were a startlingly clear blue in his soot-stained face. "Mrs. Harrow," he said. His voice was a low rumble. She did not waste time with pleasantries. "Mr. Pike, I have a business proposition for you." She explained the situation plainly, the boxcar, the welded doors, her lack of funds. "I can't pay you in cash," she finished, her voice steady, "but I will give you half of the scrap value of the car, and half of anything inside, if you will help me open it." He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He knew, as everyone in town knew, of her circumstances. He could have taken pity, offered charity. But she had offered a bargain, a partnership. He walked over to a wall of tools, selecting a heavy cold chisel and a 10-pound sledgehammer. "Let's go have a look," he said. They walked back to the boxcar in silence. He spent almost an hour examining the welds, tapping them with a hammer, listening to the sound. He scraped away rust, looking for a weakness. Finally, he nodded, more to himself than to her. "It's a brute of a job," he said, "but it was done by a man in a hurry. The welds are thick, but they're ugly. Not enough heat. I think I can break the seam." The work took the better part of the day. George used a portable forge to heat a section of the weld cherry red. Then, with Clara holding the massive chisel steady with a pair of long tongs, he swung the sledgehammer. The impact was immense, a deafening clang that vibrated through the ground. Again and again he swung, the rhythm of his blows a testament to his strength and endurance. Sweat poured down his face. Slowly, agonizingly, a hairline crack appeared in the weld. He worked his way down the seam, heat and hammer, heat and hammer. Finally, with the sun low in the sky, he drove a wedge into the fractured seam. With a final, mighty blow, the weld gave way with a screech of tortured metal. The heavy door, freed from its 40-year prison, groaned and shifted. Together, they put their shoulders to it. It moved an inch, then a foot, rolling back into the dark interior. A wave of cool, still, dry air washed over them, smelling faintly of dust, old wood, and something else, canvas and oil. They peered into the gloom. It was not empty. The interior of the boxcar was a time capsule. As their eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the open door, they saw not a chaotic jumble of scrap, but a space that was meticulously, purposefully packed. Stacks of wooden crates stood lashed to the walls, their stenciled markings still crisp and black. Long, canvas-wrapped bundles were secured overhead in netting. Barrels stood in neat rows, their lids sealed with wax. In the center of the car, bolted to the floor, was a small, sturdy oak desk and a matching chair. And on the desk sat a single object, a large, leather-bound ledger, its cover coated in a fine, undisturbed layer of dust. George Pike let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be," he murmured, his voice full of something like reverence. He reached back to the forge and lit a lantern, the warm yellow light pushing back the shadows and revealing the full extent of the treasure. It was a rolling warehouse, frozen in time. Clara stepped up into the car, her feet silent on the dusty floorboards. She ran a hand over the nearest crate. The wood was dry and sound. The stencil read, HD & Co. Hardware, Pittsburgh, PA. She moved to the next, which bore the mark of a New England textile mill. George followed with the lantern, his big frame filling the space. He picked up a small crowbar that was hanging from a hook on the wall, and, with a questioning look at Clara, gestured to the nearest crate. She nodded. With a squeal of nails, he gently pried the lid open. Inside, nestled in straw, were dozens of brand-new handsaws, their steel blades gleaming, their wooden handles smooth and unblemished. They were packed in cosmoline, a thick rust preventing grease that had preserved them perfectly. They opened another crate. It was full of hammers, their heads stamped with a maker's mark she'd never seen. Another held planes, and another, boxes of nails in every size. The canvas bundles held bolts of heavy wool and durable cotton duck, the fabric as fresh as the day it was woven. The barrels contained lanterns, wicks and all, and tins of kerosene, lamp oil and linseed oil, all sealed and sound. It was a fortune. Not a fortune in gold, but in practical, essential things. Tools, fabric, hardware, the very materials needed to build a life, a home, a town. This wasn't a lost shipment. It was a general store on wheels. Clara felt a dizzying sense of disbelief. She walked to the small desk, the island of order in this sea of provision. She wiped the dust from the ledger with her sleeve and opened it. The first page was written in a neat, elegant hand. It was not a bill of lading, but a letter. To whomever finds this car, it began. My name is Silas Croft. I was the freight agent for the Allegheny and Western Line in the year 1852. This car and its contents were my charge, and my story is tied to them. Clara and George exchanged a look. He moved the lantern closer, its light falling on the page. She began to read aloud, her voice soft in the still, heavy air of the boxcar. The letter told a story of ambition and tragedy. Silas Croft had been sent west to establish a new freight depot at a planned junction. He had invested his own life savings, everything he had, into purchasing the initial stock, the goods now filling the car around them. He was a widower, and his hope was to build a new life for himself and his young daughter. But the railroad, in its infinite and careless wisdom, had changed its plans. The junction was moved 50 miles to the south. Silas's depot, and the small town that had begun to grow around it, was left stranded. The railroad refused to compensate him for the goods they would no longer ship. Trapped, with his life's work rendered worthless, he had sealed the car, a desperate act to protect his property from local scavengers, while he went east to plead his case with the company directors. He had left a final, heartbreaking entry. I leave this record and these goods in the hope that they might one day fall into the hands of someone in need of a new start, as I was. The manifest within this ledger is complete. There is also a map, and a copy of a land claim for the quarter section, where the depot was to be built, a claim the railroad company never bothered to file or contest. It has a good well. Perhaps it will be of use to you. I am going to fetch my daughter Eleanor from her grandmother's care. I cannot imagine what future we have, but I cannot leave her behind. A small, carved wooden horse fell from between the pages as Clara turned to the manifest. It was worn smooth, clearly a child's toy. Silas Croft had never returned. Researching it later, they would find the record of a steamboat disaster on the Missouri River that year. Silas and his daughter Eleanor were on the passenger list. He had not abandoned his post. He had been lost to the river, another life erased by the heedless expansion of the nation. The boxcar, and the hope it contained, had simply been forgotten. Until now. The ledger was more than a record of loss. It was a blueprint for reclamation. For the next week, the boxcar became Clara and George's world. They worked from sunrise to sunset, a quiet, efficient team. The first task was to create a complete inventory, cross-referencing the physical goods with Silas Croft's meticulous entries. Clara sat at the small oak desk, the ledger open before her, a pen and a fresh notebook at her side. Her skill with numbers and her tidy, precise handwriting were perfectly suited to the task. George, with his brute strength and gentle hands, would open a crate or a barrel, call out the contents, and then carefully reseal it. 24 brace and bit sets, he would call, his voice echoing slightly in the long metal room. Marked Stanley Rule and Level. 24 brace and bit sets, Clara would repeat, her pen scratching across the paper. Stanley Rule and Level. Check. They developed a rhythm, a wordless dance of shared work. The process was slow and methodical, a kind of archaeology. Each item they unpacked was a connection to the past, a piece of Silas Croft's failed dream. They found boxes of fine china, carefully packed in barrels of sawdust. They found school primers and slates, evidence of his hope for a community. They even found a crate containing a small, ornate cast-iron stove, a model designed for a small home, not a rough frontier cabin. As she worked, Clara felt a growing kinship with the man who had written the ledger. She admired his foresight, the quality of the goods he had chosen, and the neatness of his records. He was a man who believed in order and quality, just as Liam had. This was not the work of a fool, but of a careful, hopeful planner betrayed by forces beyond his control. The most important document was tucked into a sleeve in the back of the ledger, the land claim. It was for a quarter section, 160 acres, and it was marked with the location of a hand-dug well. Attached was a hand-drawn map showing the property in relation to the old, abandoned A&W survey line. George, who had prospected in the hills in his youth, studied the map intently. "I know this place," he said, his finger tracing a faint line that marked a creek. "It's about 5 miles north of town. The railroad survey is long gone, but the creek is still there. They call it Cottonwood Draw. Nobody ever settled it. Too far from the main line. The land itself was worthless without the water right, but the claim, if it could be proven, granted ownership of the well, the only reliable water source for miles. The Union Pacific owned most of the land, but this small parcel, through a bureaucratic oversight 40 years old, had never been officially absorbed. It was a ghost on the map, a legal loophole big enough to drive a boxcar through. Their plan began to form, solidifying over mugs of coffee brewed on a small fire outside the car. The goods were valuable, but the land claim was the real prize. It offered a foundation, a place to stand that wasn't owned by the railroad. To claim it, however, they would need to prove a chain of title. The boxcar, its contents, and the ledger were her proof. Clara Harrow, the penniless widow, was now the heir to a 40-year-old promise. Her rebuilding would not be with wood and nails, but with paper and ink, with the careful, patient reconstruction of a dead man's legal rights. The railroad had cast her out, but an older, forgotten railroad had just given her a weapon. The first sign that their discovery had been noticed came in the form of Mr. Davies. He arrived at the salvage yard late one afternoon, his clean suit looking even more out of place amidst the rust and iron than it had at Clara's door. He did not approach the boxcar directly, but stood at a distance, watching as George loaded sorted hardware back into a crate. George saw him first, a subtle stiffening of his shoulders. Clara looked up from her ledger. "Mr. Davies," she said, her voice calm and even. He walked forward, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel. "Mrs. Harrow, I see you've made a curious investment." His eyes scanned the organized interior of the car, the neat stacks of inventory lists on the desk. His condescending smile faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of sharp, acquisitive interest. "The company has an interest in historical assets," he began, his tone smooth and reasonable. "This car, being from a defunct line, is technically an artifact. We would be prepared to offer you a fair price for it, to save you the trouble of disposing of it. Say, $50? It was 10 times what she'd paid, a significant sum. A month ago, it would have been a lifeline. Now, it was an insult. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Davies," Clara said, not looking up from her papers. "But it is not for sale." Davies's smile tightened. Perhaps you don't understand. This is company property. You are trespassing. George Pike set down the crate he was holding with a heavy thud. He was not a tall man, but he was broad, and his silence was more intimidating than any threat. "The lady holds a bill of sale," George said, his voice a low rumble. "Signed by your own auctioneer. She owns the car and its contents. We're on salvage land, not company track." Davies's gaze shifted to George, and he seemed to shrink a little. He was a man of paper and rules. George was a man of iron and fire. They were different species. "This is not over," Davies hissed, and turned on his heel, striding away. The encounter solidified their partnership. George was no longer just a hired hand, he was a defender. The community, which had first pitied and then ignored Clara, began to stir. News of the treasure car spread through town. People would walk out to the salvage yard on Sunday afternoons, staring at the boxcar as if it were a visiting circus. But a few came closer. First was Mr. Henderson, the grocer, a kind, elderly man who had always slipped an extra apple into Clara's bag. He offered the use of his dry cellar to store the fabrics and other perishable goods, protecting them from the damp and the mice. "No charge," he said, waving off her thanks. "Call it a loan. Good for the town to have a little mystery." Next came Mrs. Gable, the postmistress, a woman who knew everyone's business. She brought them a hot meal of stew and cornbread, and while they ate, she provided a detailed history of the railroad's land dealings in the area, information gleaned from years of sorting mail and overhearing conversations. She confirmed that the Cottonwood Draw parcel was a legal anomaly, a piece of land everyone knew about but no one could touch. A young lawyer, fresh from the East and eager to make a name for himself, heard the story and offered his services. Intrigued by the legal challenge, he spent an evening in the boxcar, poring over the ledger and the claim map by lantern light, his excitement growing with each page. "This is magnificent," he breathed. "This is a perfect chain of evidence." Clara's rebuilding was becoming a community project. Each person brought their own skill, their own piece of the puzzle: storage, information, legal counsel. They were drawn not just by the prospect of a fight with the powerful railroad, but by the quiet dignity of the work itself. They saw Clara not as a victim, but as a strategist, and George not as a simple blacksmith, but as a guardian. The boxcar was no longer just a container of goods. It was becoming a symbol of quiet defiance, a rallying point for the town's own forgotten hopes. The filing of the land claim at the county courthouse was a quiet affair, a matter of ink and paper, but it sent shockwaves through the railroad's local headquarters. Clara, accompanied by George and her young lawyer, presented the original claim document from Silas Croft's ledger, along with the bill of sale for the boxcar and a signed affidavit from the auctioneer. The county clerk, a man who had been bullied by the railroad's lawyers for years, stamped the documents with a grim satisfaction. The Union Pacific responded as expected, with a team of lawyers from Omaha who descended on the town like a flock of crows. They tried to have the claim dismissed, arguing that it was ancient and invalid. But Clara's lawyer was prepared. He argued that the claim had been sealed and preserved, its chain of title unbroken, by the railroad's own actions. By welding the car shut, the company had inadvertently created a perfect, tamper-proof vessel for Silas Croft's legal rights. The railroad's second tactic was to try and buy her out. Mr. Davies appeared again, this time with a much larger offer, enough money to set her up comfortably for life. He cornered her outside the general store, his voice a low, urgent murmur. "Take the money, Mrs. Harrow. You cannot win this fight. The company has endless resources. We can keep this tied up in court for years, until you have nothing left." Clara looked at him, her expression calm. "This isn't about money, Mr. Davies. It's about the land." She had come to understand that the 160 acres and its well represented something more than their monetary value. It was a chance to put down roots, to build something that could not be taken away by a ledger entry in a distant office. The fight over the land claim became the town's central drama. Support for Clara grew. The local newspaper, which usually kowtowed to the railroad, ran a front-page story detailing the history of Silas Croft and the ghost car, painting Clara as a plucky heroine. When the railroad tried to get a court order to seize the boxcar as evidence, George organized a group of men from the town, shopkeepers, ranchers, and even some off-duty railroad workers, who stood guard around the car day and night. They brought lanterns and coffee, their silent presence a clear message to the company. Clara, in the meantime, had transformed the boxcar into a place of business. With George's help, she built shelves and a counter. She was no longer living in the shadow of her property. She was inhabiting it. She began to sell the goods, not as a clearance, but as a merchant. The women of the town, tired of the limited and overpriced selection at the company store, flocked to her for quality fabric, needles, and thread. The men came for the superior tools, the likes of which hadn't been seen in Laramie for years. She was a fair trader, setting her prices based on the old manifest, and she quickly earned a reputation for honesty. She was no longer poor widow Harrow. She was Clara, the proprietor of the Boxcar Mercantile. People knew her name. They sought her out. Her small corner of the salvage yard became a new center of commerce, a place of quiet industry humming with a life of its own. George was a constant presence, his smithy now unofficially relocated to the area beside the car. He repaired wagons and sharpened plows, the ring of his anvil providing a steady rhythm to their days. Their partnership, forged in the fire of his forge and the ink of her ledger, had settled into a comfortable, unspoken affection. They were building a life together, one transaction, one hammer blow at a time. The court, swayed by public opinion and the undeniable weight of the evidence, eventually ruled in her favor. The land was hers. Clara stood in the doorway of the small, solid house they had built on the land at Cottonwood Draw. The house was made of stone cleared from the property and timber from the small grove of cottonwoods that gave the creek its name. It was not a large house, just 2 rooms and a deep porch, but it was sturdy, and it was theirs. From the porch, she could see the boxcar. George had moved it from the salvage yard with a team of 20 horses and a crew of volunteers from the town. It now rested on a permanent foundation of stone pillars, its wheels removed, its body cleaned of rust and given a fresh coat of protective black paint. It served as a dry, secure storeroom and workshop. The Boxcar Mercantile sign painted in neat white letters above the door that George had rehung on smooth, new hinges. The sun was setting, and the light caught the dust motes dancing in the air, turning them to gold. In her right hand, she held the small steel bird Liam had forged for her so long ago. Its edges were worn smooth from the years she had carried it in her pocket. It was a relic of a past life, a life of love and loss, but it was a part of her story. On the stone mantelpiece inside the house, next to a vase of wildflowers, sat a small, carved wooden horse. It was Silas Croft's daughter's toy, found between the pages of the ledger. It was a relic of another's hope, another's loss. The 2 objects, the steel bird and the wooden horse, seemed to speak to each other across the room. A silent conversation about fathers and daughters, husbands and wives, and the love that endures even after its objects are gone. Liam had taught her to see the world with clear eyes, to understand the nature of things. Silas had given her a map and a means. Both men, strangers to each other, separated by decades, had provided her with the tools she needed to survive and then to build. She heard the familiar, rhythmic sound of a hammer on steel and looked toward the new smithy George had built near the creek. He was finishing his last job of the day, his silhouette dark against the fiery glow of the forge. His presence was as solid and reliable as the anvil he worked on. Theirs was not a romance of grand declarations, but of shared labor and quiet companionship. It was in the way he kept her woodbox full, the way she made sure there was a hot meal waiting when he finished his work. It was in the easy silence that fell between them as they sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the stars appear in the vast Wyoming sky. It was a love built on a foundation of mutual respect, as solid as the stone of their house. Clara Harrow was 25 and had $3 to her name. She had been a widow with no prospects, a ghost in her own life. She spent it on a rusted boxcar no one wanted. It was the best $3 she ever spent. Thank you for joining us for this story, for sitting with Clara in the quiet and the uncertainty. Her journey reminds us that value is often hidden, waiting not for a hero, but for someone with the patience to look. If you found a measure of peace in Clara's victory, a sense of rightness in the ringing of George's anvil, we hope you'll subscribe to our channel and share this story with someone else who appreciates a quiet strength and a victory earned through hard work and clear sight. It helps these stories find the people who need them. And as you go about your day, we'd love for you to consider a question and perhaps share your thoughts in the comments below. What is the most valuable thing you have ever found? Not because you were searching for treasure, but simply because you were the only one willing to stop and truly see what was there. We often find that the best things in life are not the things that glitter, but the things that endure. The things that, like Clara's boxcar, hold within them the quiet, sturdy promise of a new beginning, waiting for the right hands to come along and unlock their potential. The world is full of such locked boxes, in salvage yards and in our own hearts. It just takes a little courage, and perhaps a partner with a strong hammer and a steady hand to see what's inside. Until next time, be well, and look for the value in the things others have left behind.